Hi, this is David Grunfeld coming to you from Dubai,
And hi, it's Mark Hayes from North America.
and this is Elevating IR, a global perspective.
David, great to see you. As you know, retail investors are becoming increasingly important consideration for investor relations officers in public companies. So,
Yeah.
long ignored by IR teams, retail investors are becoming increasingly important in many markets and for many public companies. But they're remaining challenging to predict and difficult to engage at scale. So I think one of the questions would be, you know, are retail investors, is the juice worth the squeeze for retail investors? Would love your thoughts on that.
It's an interesting question, definitely a shift. I think it's one of the more important shifts that I see globally, the growing influence of retail, and how that's changing the role and the perspective actually of IR teams to a certain degree. And I think it'll continue. You wrote an excellent piece on this recently, which I advise everybody go and take a look at. Look, retail investors are no longer passive participants at the margins of the market. In many regions, they account for a meaningful share of trading activity and increasingly long-term ownership as well, not just day traders, right? So with digital platforms, social communities, and 24/7 access to the markets, this has fundamentally changed how individuals discover companies and form views and then ultimately invest and act on those views, right? So investing no longer happens only around earning seasons. It happens constantly, globally, 24/7, right? And what makes this particularly challenging for IR is that retail investors are more organized, more vocal, more interconnected than really ever before. And narratives are moving fast. Attention is fragmented. It's really a competition for attention, not just capital. And you're not just competing against peers in your sector, but really against every other opportunity, that is capturing mind share at that particular moment. So, in my experience, this also intersects with something a bit deeper, and it's we've spoken about this before, Mark. It's the blurring of lines between investors and customers and employees, and people are increasingly investing in brands that they use and they trust and they identify with, and that means communication and tone and accessibility matter more than ever before. So, you can comply perfectly with disclosure rules and still fail to engage the audience that's shaping perception in real time. So, look, when I think about across different markets, bringing in kind of an international flavor here, expectations really vary widely. Retail investors in the U.S. and Europe, in the Middle East, in Asia, behave very differently. They use different channels. They organize differently. They invest differently. But the common thread is really that they all expect transparency, responsiveness, and clarity, and that mirrors their experience as consumers of digital products and services as well, right? A lot of it is being gamified, which I think is very interesting as well. So, look, the approach that I encourage is to treat retail as an always-on dialogue, not a quarterly broadcast. While a lot of the activity taking place on a trading platform or in chat rooms, corporate websites and investor assistants like Arrow are becoming critical touch points, and not just for answering questions, but for feeding search engines and LLMs with accurate, up-to-date information, so that companies can be the source of truth for their own stories and performance. So, and analyzing patterns in retail and the journeys that retail investors take helps to identify where there might be comms breakdowns and where trust can be strengthened. So I think that when companies take this seriously, the payoff isn't just hype or noise. It's really a better understanding, stronger investor communities, and a more resilient narrative in markets where attention and confidence can shift very quickly.
That's so interesting, David, and I agree with you completely. It's a critically important global macro trend for public companies and investor relations officers. Just to build on that, I think there are a couple of things that I think are really interesting about this space. The first is it's a clear example of where the tools of the marketer become the tools of the IRO. And so I think one of the most important things that public companies can do is really segment their retail investor audience and think very specifically about how you can actually personalize content at scale to attract, retain, and grow that investor base. The second thing that you mentioned, and I thought it was so interesting, was the way in which public companies can think about the signal from retail investors. There was a question recently that was posed on the NERI message board as it relates to if there is a bet on Kalshi, how would that inform the way in which public companies would think about contouring their messaging? To your point, Kalshi is not actually an isolated platform. It exists alongside other channels where investors are actually looking for other information. So is that a signal? And would you pay attention to that in a retail context if somebody's investing behind what they think is, essentially a signal from a platform like that? And finally, I think one of the most important questions, and you mentioned this, is how do we begin to think about communicating at scale with retail investors on the right channel for them, and that channel mix is likely to be quite different globally. And we recently did an analysis of US-based channels, 14 different channels, and scored them based on the optimal mix or basket of channels for retail investors. And it actually turned out that was actually quite different than I think most folks would understand, where things like YouTube, LinkedIn, and Meta actually outperformed what I think are traditional platforms that people think in terms of Reddit, both in terms of reach and in terms of sophistication. So clearly a key important topic, and looking forward to continuing the dialogue on this with you.